Imagine being a child. Not a soldier. Not a rebel. Not a criminal. Just a child. One morning, you wake up in your village. The air is cold. The sun barely touches the mountains. You hear unfamiliar voices. Boots on stone. Metal armor. Foreign language. Your mother stops breathing for a moment. Because she already knows. They have come again. Not to burn the village. Not to steal food. They have come for something far more valuable. They have come for children. This is not a legend. This is not exaggeration. This is the true story of one of the most disturbing systems in human history. This is the story of the Ottoman Devshirme System. By the late 14th century, the Ottoman Empire was rising fast. Faster than anyone expected. From a small Anatolian state, it expanded into the Balkans, Eastern Europe, the Middle East. But expansion created a dangerous problem. Power. In medieval history, power always betrayed kings. Noble families plotted. Generals rebelled. Armies turned against their rulers. Every empire that relied on nobles eventually collapsed. The Ottoman sultans understood this early. They asked a terrifying question. What if we create servants who have no family, no loyalty, and no past? That question gave birth to a system unlike anything the world had seen before. A system built not on bloodlines, but on stolen childhoods. The Devshirme system began in the late 1300s. Its purpose was simple but brutal. To create a ruling class that belonged only to the Sultan. No tribe. No inheritance. No loyalty except the state. The solution? Take children young enough to be reshaped. Christian boys from conquered lands were chosen because they had no political power. They had no alliances. They could be completely reprogrammed. This was not random cruelty. It was calculated. Cold. Efficient. The arrival of Ottoman officials followed a pattern. Villages were gathered. Families were lined up. Children were inspected. Not with kindness. With precision. Teeth were checked. Muscles examined. Posture evaluated. Eyes studied for intelligence. Too weak. Rejected. Too sick. Rejected. Too old. Rejected. The empire wanted perfection. Mothers cried. Fathers begged. Some tried to hide their sons in forests or cellars. But resistance was useless. Once a boy was chosen, he legally belonged to the Sultan. In that moment, he stopped being a son. The journey away from home was slow. Days. Sometimes weeks. Boys walked in chains or guarded groups. They spoke different languages. They shared the same fear. Some cried for days. Some went silent. Some never spoke again. This journey had a purpose. Not transportation. But transformation. By the time they reached Ottoman cities, many had already begun to forget. Their mother's voice. Their village. Their prayers. Memory faded. And the empire welcomed that. The first thing taken from them was their faith. They were converted to Islam. Not gradually. Not voluntarily. Immediately. They received new names. New clothes. New rules. Speaking their old language was forbidden. Contact with family was forbidden. Even remembering their past was discouraged. The goal was clear. Erase the boy. Create the servant. This was not education. It was psychological reconstruction. After conversion, the children were divided. Two paths. Two fates. Path 1, the palace. The most intelligent boys were sent to the imperial palace. There, they studied politics, mathematics, warfare, languages, religion. They lived under constant observation. Every word was measured. Every emotion controlled. They were being shaped into future rulers. Some would become Grand Viziers, military commanders, advisors to the Sultan, men who ruled millions, men who once cried for their mothers. Path 2, the Janissaries. The rest became soldiers. The Janissaries. They lived under iron discipline. No marriage. No family. No personal wealth. Their lives belonged to the army. They trained endlessly. They obeyed without question. They feared dishonor more than death. They became one of the most feared military forces in history. Here lies the dark contradiction. The Devshirme system was cruel. But it also created opportunity. A poor village boy could rise higher than any noble. He could command armies, control provinces, stand beside the Sultan. But the price was absolute. No past. No family. No identity. Power, bought with erasure. Over time, something strange happened. These boys stopped seeing themselves as victims. The empire became their family. The Sultan became their father. The state became their religion. They defended it fiercely. Because without it, they were nothing. And that was the true genius of the system. By the end of training, the child was gone. In his place stood a soldier, a bureaucrat, a weapon. The Devshirme had succeeded. The empire had created humans without roots. And for centuries, it worked. By the time the boy reached adolescence, he no longer remembered his mother's voice. He no longer remembered his old name. The language of his childhood had faded into silence. In its place stood something new. Something created. Something owned. He was no longer a child. He was now property of the empire. And his life was about to become far more brutal. Not every boy taken through the Devshirme would rule. Most were sent to become soldiers. But not ordinary soldiers. They became Janissaries, the elite military force of the Ottoman Empire. From the moment they entered training, their humanity was stripped away. They were taught absolute obedience, complete emotional control, total loyalty to the Sultan. They were forbidden to marry, own property, have families, live independent lives. Their existence had one purpose: war. Janissary life was harsh and unforgiving. Days began before sunrise. Training never stopped. They trained with swords, bows, muskets, hand-to-hand combat. Pain was expected. Weakness was punished. Disobedience meant whipping, imprisonment, execution. There was no appeal. No mercy. The system was designed to break individuality, to erase fear, to produce perfect weapons. What made the Janissaries different from other armies was not just discipline. It was psychology. They were taught from childhood that death was honorable. Obedience was sacred. The Sultan was divine authority. They did not fear dying. They feared disobedience. They marched without hesitation. They attacked without retreat. They obeyed without question. European armies, built on feudal loyalty, could not compete. When Janissaries arrived, cities surrendered. The most dangerous man is one with nothing to lose. Janissaries had no families to protect, no land to return to. No identity outside the empire. Their entire existence depended on the state. This made them unstoppable. They fought with a calm that terrified enemies. Because death meant nothing to them. They had already lost everything that mattered. Ironically, the Devshirme system created some of the most powerful men in Ottoman history. Former Christian boys became Grand Viziers, military commanders, governors of entire regions. They ruled over populations that once looked like their own families. They enforced laws, collected taxes, commanded armies. But they never ruled themselves. They were powerful, but never free. Over time, the system began to decay. Janissaries gained influence. They realized their power. Slowly, rules were broken. They were allowed to marry, own businesses, pass positions to their sons. The system that was built on discipline became infected by greed. And when warriors gain wealth, they begin to seek control. By the 17th century, the Janissaries were no longer servants. They were kingmakers. They overthrew sultans. They demanded higher pay. They blocked reforms. Any ruler who challenged them risked death. The empire was no longer in control of its army. The army controlled the empire. And this was fatal. Sultans began to fear their own guards. Every reform attempt was met with rebellion. Every modernization effort crushed. The Janissaries had become untouchable. They were no longer the empire's shield. They were its greatest threat. And everyone knew it. The Devshirme system had succeeded too well. It created soldiers too powerful to control. Too organized to remove. Too dangerous to confront directly. The empire was trapped by its own invention. The question was no longer if the system would fall, but how much blood it would take. By the early 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was weakening. European armies modernized. Technology advanced. The Janissaries refused to change. They clung to tradition. They resisted reform. They threatened the future. And the Sultan finally understood. To save the empire, the Janissaries had to die. For centuries, the Devshirme system worked perfectly. Too perfectly. The empire believed it had created the ultimate soldiers. Loyal. Disciplined. Fearless. But something changed. The servants had grown powerful. And power always demands more power. By the 17th century, the Janissaries were no longer silent weapons. They had found their voice. And that voice would shake the empire to its core. At first, the change was subtle. Janissaries began questioning orders. They demanded higher wages. They refused campaigns they did not approve of. Sultans tolerated it. They had no choice. The Janissaries controlled the capital. They controlled the palace. They controlled the army. To oppose them meant death. Slowly, fear changed sides. The rulers now feared their own soldiers. The first major revolts shocked the empire. Janissaries marched through Istanbul. They destroyed shops. They burned buildings. They demanded the execution of officials. And often, they got what they wanted. Several grand viziers were murdered by mobs of their own soldiers. Sultans were forced to abdicate, reverse reforms, pay enormous bribes. The empire was no longer ruled from the throne. It was ruled from the barracks. One of the most terrifying moments came when Janissaries deposed a sultan. Not in secret. In public. They dragged him from the palace. Humiliated him. And executed him. The message was clear. The sultan ruled only with their permission. From that moment on, every ruler lived in fear. The Janissaries had become everything they were created to prevent. They formed political factions, protected their own interests, blocked modernization, resisted new weapons. They refused European-style reforms. They rejected discipline. They rejected change. And while Europe modernized, the Ottoman Empire stagnated. By the late 1700s, the empire was falling behind. European armies used modern firearms, organized formations, advanced logistics. The Janissaries, they clung to tradition. They refused new drills. They rejected modern weapons. They mocked reformers. Every attempt to modernize the army ended the same way. With blood. Sultan Mahmud II knew the truth. If the Janissaries remained, the empire would die. He tried reforms quietly. They failed. He tried compromise. They revolted. Finally, he made a decision that no ruler before him dared to make. He would destroy them. Completely. Mahmud II announced the creation of a new modern army. He knew what would happen. The Janissaries reacted exactly as expected. They revolted. They marched through Istanbul. They prepared for another coup. But this time, the Sultan was ready. In 1826, history turned red. The Sultan ordered loyal troops to surround the Janissary barracks. Artillery was positioned. Cannons were aimed at the buildings. When the Janissaries refused to surrender, the order was given. Fire. The barracks exploded. Thousands died in minutes. Survivors were hunted down. Some were executed publicly. Others were drowned. Many were exiled. By the end of the week, the Janissaries no longer existed. The streets of Istanbul were quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in centuries, the empire had no Janissaries. The system that once created power was erased in blood. Their records were destroyed. Their name banned. Their memory erased. The Devshirme system was officially dead. But history never truly disappears. The Devshirme left behind a legacy of fear. A warning about absolute power. A lesson about control. It proved something terrifying. You can create perfect soldiers, but you can never control what they become. When the smoke cleared. When the cannons fell silent. When the last Janissary body was removed from the streets of Istanbul. Something felt wrong. The empire was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in centuries, the system that had shaped Ottoman power was gone. But its shadow remained. Because even when a system dies, its consequences live on. The destruction of the Janissaries in 1826 shocked the world. Thousands were killed. Entire institutions erased. Even the name Janissary was forbidden. The Sultan ordered their symbols destroyed. Their history erased. Their memory condemned. But history does not disappear so easily. The empire had lost more than soldiers. It had lost the structure that once held it together. And without it, everything began to fall apart. For over 400 years, the Devshirme system had achieved something no empire had done before. It created absolute loyalty, total obedience, a ruling class without bloodlines. But it also created something far more dangerous. A state that believed it could reshape humans. A government that believed identity could be erased. And when a state believes that, there is no limit to what it will justify. The Devshirme proved that power can be engineered. But it also proved that such power always demands a terrible cost. Hundreds of thousands of boys passed through the system. Most left no records. No graves. No names. They lived. They served. They disappeared. Some became legends. Most became shadows. We remember the empire. We remember the battles. We remember the sultans. But we rarely remember the children who paid the price. They never chose war. They never chose loyalty. They never chose sacrifice. It was chosen for them. Historians still debate this question. Some argue. The boys were educated. They gained power. They rose beyond their birth. Others argue. They were taken by force. Stripped of identity. Denied free will. Both are correct. The Devshirme was not slavery in chains. It was slavery of the mind. A system where freedom was replaced with purpose. And purpose replaced humanity. What happens to a child raised without identity? Without family? Without choice? They become loyal. But not because they love. Because they have nothing else. This is the darkest truth of the Devshirme. It did not rely on fear alone. It relied on emptiness. The emptiness of a child who grows up believing the state is all that exists. The Devshirme is not just history. Its logic still exists. Any system that removes individuality, rewards obedience, punishes memory, controls identity, follows the same path. Different uniforms. Different flags. Same principle. The Devshirme reminds us that oppression does not always come with chains. Sometimes. It comes with opportunity. The Ottoman Empire believed it had created the perfect solution. A loyal army. A controlled elite. A system without rebellion. But in the end, that system weakened the very empire it was meant to protect. Because innovation was blocked. Fear replaced reform. Power concentrated too tightly. And when the world changed, the empire could not. The Devshirme did not save the Ottomans. It delayed their fall. At a terrible human cost. History is full of conquerors. But few systems are as disturbing as the Devshirme. Not because of blood. But because of precision. Because it shows how easily humans can be reshaped. If taken young enough. If isolated long enough. If controlled completely. It proves something chilling. The most powerful weapon is not the sword. It is the mind. So we end with one final question. Was the Devshirme a crime? Or a masterpiece of statecraft? The answer depends on who you ask. The empire saw strength. The historians see complexity. The children saw loss. And maybe that is the truth of all empires. They are built by those who rule. And paid for by those who never chose to serve. The Devshirme system is gone. But its lesson remains. Power can create order. Order can create greatness. But greatness built on stolen lives always demands a reckoning. And history always collects its debt.